The year is 1938. New York City is in the grip of a suffocating heat wave, the kind that melts the asphalt and turns the subway tunnels into ovens. Yet, in a forgotten meatpacking warehouse in the Bronx, the police discovered a scene that defied the laws of physics. 3 looters had broken in, looking for scrap metal. They were found huddled together in the basement, frozen solid. Their skin was blue, covered in a layer of frost an inch thick, their faces twisted in silent screams of absolute terror. It was 95 degrees outside, but inside that room, it was 50 below zero. The coroner said their hearts didn't just stop, they shattered like glass. The warehouse has been condemned since 1910, following the mysterious death of a butcher named Silas Vane. They say Silas didn't just slaughter cattle, he slaughtered anything that got in his way. Tonight, we aren't just opening a door. We are breaking the seal on a freezer full of nightmares. You are about to enter a place where the cold burns like fire, and the shadows have teeth. Put on your coat. It's going to get cold. Kane Bones sat in his office on 42nd Street, the fan on his desk rattling uselessly against the oppressive July heat. His shirt was stuck to his back, and the ice in his whiskey glass had melted long ago. Kane was a man who knew the city better than the rats in the sewers. He dealt in the things that went bump in the night, the cases the NYPD filed under unsolved and then burned. He was a detective of the paranormal, a weary guardian standing between the oblivious public and the hungry dark. He didn't do it for the money, which was scarce, but because he was the only one who could see the cracks in the world where the monsters slipped through. The knock on his door was heavy, frantic. The man who entered was a giant, a construction foreman named Jack Miller, age 45. Jack looked like he could punch through a brick wall, but right now he was shaking like a leaf. He told Kane about the renovation project at the old meatpacking district in the Bronx. His crew had opened a sealed basement door, and since then, the temperature had dropped so low their tools were snapping. But it wasn't just the cold. Jack whispered about the white shape, a figure made of mist and malice that stalked the freezing fog. It had whispered his name. Kane looked at the frost forming on his eyebrows, right there in the sweltering office. He knew this wasn't a natural phenomenon. He grabbed his trench coat, ignoring the heat outside. He was going to a place where the sun couldn't reach. Leave your like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments from which city and country you are watching this story. I will love to know how far these stories are reaching.
Kane Bones stared at the puddle of water forming at Jack Miller's feet. It wasn't sweat, it was melting ice falling from the man's heavy work boots. In the middle of a New York July, where the heat index was pushing 100 degrees, this man was carrying the chill of a grave. Jack sat heavily in the wooden chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He was a man used to hard labor, to the noise of jackhammers and the grit of concrete, but his eyes held the hollow 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen war or something worse. He pulled the flask from his pocket, his fingers trembling so violently he could barely unscrew the cap. "I don't believe in ghosts, Mr. Bones," Jack stammered, his voice rough with gravel and fear. "I believe in steel and stone, but what I saw down there, steel don't bleed, and stone don't scream." He explained that his construction company had been hired to clear out the old Vane meatpacking plant in the Bronx. It was supposed to be a simple demolition job, knock it down, clear the debris, make way for new tenements. But when they breached the sub-basement 3 days ago, the air pressure in the building shifted. A wind smelling of copper and rotten meat blasted out of the hole. 2 of his men, seasoned workers, had quit on the spot. They said they heard pigs squealing, but the sound was distorted, sounding human. Jack had stayed. He was the foreman. He had a job to finish. But yesterday he found his best welder, a kid named Tony, locked in a meat locker that had no lock. When they got the door open, Tony was catatonic, whispering about the butcher. Kane listened intently, his psychic senses already tingling. The air around Jack was vibrating with residual spectral energy. It felt sharp, like needles on the skin. Kane reached out and touched the back of Jack's hand. It was freezing. Not just cold, but a supernatural void of heat. "This butcher," Kane asked, lighting a cigarette to mask the smell of ozone that was starting to fill the room, "did you see him?" Jack nodded slowly. "I saw a shadow, huge, holding a cleaver. It walked through a solid brick wall, Mr. Bones, and everywhere it stepped, ice bloomed on the floor like black mold." Kane stood up, holstering his .38 Special, loaded with silver rounds and grabbing a pouch of rock salt mixed with iron filings. He knew the history of the Vane plant. Silas Vane was a monster in human skin who died in 1910, allegedly locked in his own freezer by his abused workers. It seemed Silas wasn't done cutting. "Let's go," Kane said, his voice grim. "The dead don't like to be kept waiting, and it sounds like Silas is looking for fresh cuts."
The drive to the Bronx was a journey from the furnace into the abyss. The city was sweating, the streets crowded with people trying to escape the apartments that had turned into ovens. But as Kane and Jack approached the industrial sector, the crowds thinned. The Vane meatpacking plant stood isolated in a lot overgrown with weeds that looked sickly and pale. The building was a brick monstrosity, its windows boarded up with wood that had rotted black. Even from the street, Kane could feel the malevolence radiating from the structure. It was a psychic black hole. As they stepped out of Jack's truck, Kane noticed the silence. No crickets, no distant traffic noise, no birds, just a heavy, oppressive stillness. They walked toward the site entrance, a hole smashed into the side of the main loading bay. Jack hesitated at the threshold. "I can't go back in there, Kane," he whispered. "It wants me." Kane placed a hand on his shoulder. "It wants fear, Jack. Don't feed it." Kane stepped through the breach. Immediately, the temperature dropped 40 degrees. It was disorienting. The heat of the night was replaced by a damp, biting chill that seeped through Kane's trench coat instantly. His breath plumed before him in thick white clouds. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a cavernous room filled with rusted meat hooks hanging from the ceiling like stalactites. They swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Clink, clink, clink. The sound of metal on metal echoed rhythmically. Kane walked further in, his boots crunching on something brittle. He looked down. The floor was covered in a thin layer of frost, creating a crystalline path leading toward the basement stairs. The walls were weeping condensation that froze as it trickled down, forming long, jagged icicles that looked like teeth. The smell was overpowering here, a mix of ammonia, old blood, and something ancient and dusty. Kane scanned the room with his spiritual sight. He could see faint, residual trails of energy like smoke looping around the meat hooks. This place was a battery of pain, charged by years of slaughter, animal and potentially human. "Show me where you found Tony," Kane commanded, his voice echoing too loudly in the frozen cathedral. Jack pointed a shaking finger toward a heavy steel door at the far end of the hall. The metal of the door was warped, bulging outward as if something had been pounding on it from the inside. As they approached, the heavy iron handle slowly began to turn on its own.
Kane kicked the door open before the entity could finish its intimidation tactic. The door slammed against the wall with a deafening clang that reverberated through the hollow building. Inside, the room was a freezer, but it looked more like a torture chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were rusted tools, saws, cleavers, hooks, and mallets. In the center of the room stood a large wooden chopping block, stained black with fluids that had soaked into the grain decades ago. But what drew Kane's attention was the mirror. A pristine oval mirror hung on the back wall, completely out of place in a meat locker. It wasn't frosted over like everything else. It was clear, impossibly clear. "That wasn't there before," Jack whispered, backing away. "That mirror, it wasn't there yesterday." Kane approached the glass cautiously. He knew mirrors were portals, thin veils between the living world and the astral plane. In a place this charged with negative energy, a mirror was a dangerous open door. Kane looked into the reflection. He saw himself, he saw Jack behind him, and he saw the room. But in the reflection, the room wasn't empty. Standing in the corner, deep in the glass, was a man. He was huge, wearing a leather apron stained dark. He wore a mask made of burlap, and in his hand was a cleaver that dripped fresh red blood. Kane spun around, gun raised. The corner of the real room was empty. He looked back at the mirror. The figure in the mirror took a step forward. "Jack." The whisper didn't come from the mirror. It came from right beside Jack's ear. Jack screamed and swatted at the air, stumbling back into a rack of meat hooks. The hooks swung violently, clattering together like church bells. The temperature in the room plummeted further, the air turning into a white fog. Frost began to race across the floor, moving aggressively toward their feet like a living snake. "It's manifesting!" Kane yelled. "Jack, get behind me! Do not look in the mirror!" Kane grabbed a handful of salt and threw it at the glass. The salt sizzled as it hit the surface, sparking like a live wire. The figure in the mirror roared, a sound of grinding metal and dying cattle, and the glass cracked down the center.
But the crack didn't break the mirror. It opened it. A black, freezing mist began to pour out of the fissure, taking the shape of a massive hand reaching for them.
The black mist poured from the cracked mirror like smoke from a tire fire, thick and oily, carrying with it a scent of decay so potent it made Kane's eyes water. "Run!" Kane roared, shoving Jack toward the exit. They scrambled out of the meat locker, their boots slipping on the rapidly freezing floor. The hallway outside had transformed. The frost was no longer just a coating. It had grown into jagged spikes that jutted from the walls and ceiling, turning the corridor into the gullet of some crystalline beast. The temperature was now lethal. Kane could feel the moisture in his nose freezing with every inhale, a sharp, stabbing pain. They ran blindly into the main processing plant, a labyrinth of conveyor belts, rusted grinders, and hanging chains. Behind them, the heavy steel door of the locker was ripped off its hinges with a shriek of tearing metal. The entity, Silas Vane, was no longer just a shadow in a mirror. He was manifesting physically, drawing mass from the moisture in the air. Heavy, wet footsteps thud against the concrete. Thump, squelch, thump. Kane scanned the cavernous room for a defensible position. "Up there!" he shouted, pointing to the foreman's catwalk that overlooked the slaughter floor. They sprinted toward the metal stairs. Jack, breathless and terrified, stumbled on a patch of black ice. He went down hard. "Get up!" Kane yelled, grabbing Jack's collar. As he pulled the big man up, Kane looked back. Emerging from the fog was a monstrosity. Silas Vane stood 7 feet tall, his body a patchwork of frozen flesh and blue ice. His burlap mask was fused to his face, and his apron was stiff with frozen gore. In his hand he dragged a cleaver the size of a tombstone, sparks flying as it scraped the concrete. Silas didn't run. He stalked with the inevitability of a glacier. He raised his free hand, and the conveyor belts around them suddenly roared to life. The rusted machinery screamed as gears ground together. Hooks swung violently on their chains, aiming for Kane and Jack like metallic vipers. "He controls the factory," Kane realized. "We are in his machine now." Kane fired 2 shots from his .38. The silver bullets hit Silas's chest, exploding into puffs of holy magnesium. The giant staggered, roaring in annoyance rather than pain. The silver burned him, but the cold was too thick. It was healing him as fast as Kane could shoot. They needed to get higher. They scrambled up the rusting stairs to the catwalk just as a massive hook swung through the space where Jack's head had been a second before.
From the high vantage point of the catwalk, the true scale of the horror was visible. The factory floor below was a graveyard of industry. But as Kane looked down, the scene began to shift. The residual energy was so strong, it was overriding reality. The rusted machines flickered and looked new again. Phantom figures, spectral echoes of the workers from 1910, appeared in the haze. They were silent, gray figures, heads bowed, working in a rhythmic, terrified unison. Kane gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He was seeing the past. He saw Silas Vane walking among them, striking them, laughing. He saw the workers not as employees, but as prisoners. And then he saw the mutiny. The vision sharpened. Kane saw the workers cornering Silas. They didn't just lock him in the freezer, they beat him with the very tools of his trade.
They dragged him, screaming, not to the locker they had just fled, but to the industrial incinerator at the far end of the plant. "Jack!" Kane shouted over the mechanical din. "The legend is wrong. He didn't die in the freezer. They tried to burn him." Jack looked at Kane, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. So fire killed him?" "No," Kane replied, watching the ghostly reenactment. "Look." In the vision, the workers threw Silas into the furnace, but the machine malfunctioned. It didn't light. Instead, in their panic, they sealed the iron door and turned on the coolant pipes that ran through the walls to cool the engines. They froze him alive inside the unlit furnace. He died in the dark, encased in iron and ice, swearing vengeance. The vision faded, leaving only the dark, frozen reality. Kane turned his eyes to the massive, cylindrical shape of the incinerator looming at the north end of the factory. It was covered in a layer of ice so thick it looked like an iceberg. That was the heart of the haunting. Silas wasn't attached to the building. He was attached to his own frozen corpse, still sealed inside that iron belly. "We have to go to the furnace," Kane said, reloading his revolver. "We have to finish what they started in 1910. We have to burn him."
Getting to the furnace meant crossing the entire length of the kill floor, an open space dominated by the enraged spirit of the butcher. As they descended the stairs on the far side, the air grew still. The machinery stopped. The silence was heavier than the noise. Silas was waiting. Kane pulled a glass vial from his inner pocket. Greek fire, a volatile alchemical mixture he saved for the worst cases. "Jack, listen to me," Kane whispered. "I'm going to draw him out. You need to get to the gas main valve on the wall behind the furnace. It's rusted shut. You need to open it." Jack nodded, terror sweating out of him and freezing on his skin. I can do that." Kane stepped into the open. "Vane!" he shouted, his voice echoing. "You died like a pig in a trap. You aren't a monster. You're just dead meat." The provocation worked. The floor in front of Kane exploded upward as icicles erupted like spears. Kane dove to the right, rolling across the slick concrete. Silas materialized from the shattered ice, moving faster now. He swung the massive cleaver. Kane dodged, but the wind of the weapon knocked him back. The blade smashed into a concrete pillar, severing it effortlessly. Kane fired his remaining rounds into Silas's face, blinding the entity momentarily. Meanwhile, Jack sprinted for the back wall. He reached the massive red wheel of the gas valve. It was coated in ice. He grabbed it, heaving with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. "Kane, it's frozen solid!" Jack screamed. Silas heard him. The giant turned, ignoring Kane, and charged toward Jack. The ground shook with every step. Kane scrambled to his feet. He couldn't let Silas reach Jack. He sprinted, tackling the ghost from behind. It was like tackling a statue of dry ice. The cold burned through Kane's clothes instantly, searing his skin. Kane gasped, his muscles seizing up from the thermal shock. Silas grabbed Kane by the throat and lifted him into the air. Kane stared into the burlap mask. Behind the eye holes there was nothing but an infinite swirling blizzard. Kane's vision began to blur. He was freezing to death in seconds.
"Jack, use the wrench," Kane wheezed, his voice failing. Jack, seeing Kane dangling like a rag doll, found a surge of adrenaline.
He grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from a nearby workbench and smashed it against the frozen valve wheel. The ice shattered. Jack hooked the wrench and pulled with a primal roar. Creak! The valve turned. The hiss of gas filled the air. Kane, his consciousness fading, smirked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the vial of Greek fire. He didn't throw it at Silas. He smashed it against the unexpected hardness of the entity's chest. The liquid splashed over them both. "Light it up, Jack," Kane choked out. Silas threw Kane across the room just as Jack pulled out his Zippo lighter and threw it into the invisible cloud of gas accumulating near the furnace. Boom! The explosion was deafening. A fireball rolled across the ceiling, consuming the oxygen. But the real fire was at the furnace. The gas line ignited, engulfing the area in a roaring inferno. The heat wave hit the ice, causing a reaction that sounded like a bomb going off. The ice shielding the furnace melted in seconds. The iron door of the furnace, weakened by decades of rust and thermal stress, blew open. Inside, the withered, frozen corpse of Silas Vane was visible for the first time in 28 years. The spirit of Silas shrieked, a sound that shattered the remaining windows. As the fire connected with his physical remains, the spectral form of the butcher caught fire. The blue ice turned to steam. He flailed, trying to chop at the flames with his cleaver, but the fire was purifying. It was absolute. The spirit dissolved into black smoke, sucked up into the ventilation shaft, and out into the Bronx night.
The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of small fires and the drip, drip, drip of melting ice. The unnatural cold evaporated instantly, replaced by the humid, sticky heat of the New York summer rushing back in. Kane lay on the wet concrete, coughing up water as his lungs thawed. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Jack. The big foreman was covered in soot, his eyebrows singed, but he was alive. We got him," Jack panted, helping Kane to sit up. Kane checked his limbs, frostbitten, but he would keep his fingers. He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling slightly in his hand. The smoke tasted better than anything he had ever known. They walked out of the warehouse into the dawn. The sun was rising over the city, painting the gritty streets in hues of gold and orange. The police sirens were wailing in the distance, finally alerted by the explosion. Kane stopped at the gate. "The police will find a body in that furnace," Kane said, his voice raspy. "An old one. Let 'em have it. It's a cold case closed." Jack looked at the detective. "How do I pay you, Mr. Bones? I don't have much." Kane adjusted his fedora, pulling the brim low to shield his eyes from the sun. "You saved my life in there, Jack. We're square. Just do me a favor. Demolish that place. Leave nothing but dirt." Jack nodded solemnly. Kane turned and began the long walk back to the subway station. The city was waking up, oblivious to the war that had been fought in the dark. People rushed to work, complaining about the heat, unaware that for a few hours hell had frozen over in the Bronx. Kane Bones blended into the crowd, a solitary figure in a trench coat, carrying the weight of the unseen world on his shoulders. He needed a drink, a long sleep, and a new coat. But as he descended into the subway, he felt the familiar tug of the shadows. The city had millions of stories, and most of them were nightmares waiting to be told.